And now, from Lincoln, Nebraska, the life of William Jennings Bryan is profiled on the C-SPAN series, The Contenders.
Good evening and welcome to the third installment of C-SPAN's The Contender series. Tonight, we look at the life, legacy, and times of William Jennings Bryan, the three-time presidential nominee from Nebraska. What better way to introduce you to the man than hearing directly from him? So here's a portion of the speech that he delivered at the Democratic National Convention back in 1896. It's commonly referred to as the Cross of Gold speech, which led directly to his first run for the White House at the age of 36.
We do not come as aggressors. Our war is not a war of conquest. We are fighting in defense of our homes, our families, and posterity. We have petitions, and our petitions have been scorned. We have entreated, and our entreaties have been disregarded. We have begged, and they have mocked when our calamity came. We beg no longer. We entreat no more. We petition no more. We defy them. We go forth confident that we shall win.
The words of William Jennings Bryan. We're coming to you from his home and office in the state capital of Lincoln, Nebraska. It's commonly referred to as Fairview because at the turn of the century it gave you a fair view of the land. William Jennings Bryan and his wife moved here back in 1902. It is now part of the Bryan LGH Medical Center. We're coming to you from the first floor. His parlor, his study, is just below us. He did much of his writing and entertaining here in this house, and we want to welcome our two guests. Michael Kazin is a professor of history at Georgetown University. He's also the author of A Godly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan, and William Thomas III is the chair of the Department of History at the University of Nebraska here at Lincoln. Gentlemen, thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
Michael Kazin, let me begin with you to set up this speech, the man that delivered it, the setting in Chicago, and the impact that it had on Democratic delegates in 1896.
Well, the country was very divided in 1896. There was a Great Depression on. The Democrats were split really down the middle. The incumbent president, Grover Cleveland, was very unpopular, as presidents usually are during Great Depressions. And so Bryan comes into this convention in Chicago as sort of a dark horse candidate for the presidency, but everyone knows he's a wonderful orator. He's defending the cause of free silver, which meant inflating the money supply, helping debtors, helping people in trouble economically. And he gives this speech which people go wild when they hear it, partly because he had a wonderful voice. The tape that you played was actually recorded in 1923, not in 1896. The technology didn't exist yet to record a speech live in 1896. So he doesn't sound like a 36-year-old man in that. And at 36, he was robust, he was vigorous, he had an amazing voice that could be heard without amplification by 10,000 people at a time. So he really had set this up so that he would give a speech at a time in the convention where he knew the majority of delegates were for him, but at the same time, no really riveting speech had been given yet for the silver cause at that time. So he had found his moment, and he used it to great effect.
Will Thomas, we're going to hear more from the Cross of Gold speech, and as you indicated, his words recorded in 1923. But here is a race in which he was challenging William McKinley. He was relatively unknown, served only 2 terms in the House of Representatives from here in Nebraska, ran for the Senate, won the popular vote, but lost because the Republican legislature here in Nebraska gave it to the Republican candidate. So moving into this period of 1895-96 and William Jennings Bryan.
Sure. Well, it was a tumultuous time in American politics. There had been a major strike, a railroad strike in 1894, that tore the country apart and revealed to Americans just how maybe unstable the economy was and how deep this depression might become. And William Jennings Bryan ran as a Democrat and a populist in 1894 for the United States Senate. And he ran against a railroad attorney named John Thurston. So he gained a lot of national attention, really, with this Senate campaign in 1894. I would liken it to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He had a series of debates with John Thurston, and those gave him great visibility across the nation among the political class. And so he emerged as a sort of a national figure at that time. And the country was desperate for leadership. It was all the parties were divided. The Republicans were divided. The populists were on the scene. The Republicans had won the presidential contest in Nebraska in 1892, but the second place vote getter was the populist. And the Democrats, Cleveland, was far behind. So the Democratic Party was in deep trouble in this part of the Midwest.
William Jennings Bryan, one of 14 presidential candidates who lost the election but changed American politics. We're in Lincoln, Nebraska, and here's more, the words of William Jennings Bryan from his famous Cross of Gold speech.
They tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country. We care not upon what line the battle is fought. If they say bimetallism is good, but that we cannot have it until other nations help us, we reply that instead of having a gold standard, because England has, we will restore bimetallism, and then let England have bimetallism because the United States has. If they dare to come out in the upon a cross of gold.
Michael Kazin, how long was the speech in 1896, and why was it referred to as a cross of gold?
It was about 45 minutes long. And Cross of Gold was a powerful metaphor, obviously, for a country in which most people are Christians, and William Jennings Bryan was a very serious evangelical Christian. For him, those who wanted to keep the country on the gold standard wanted to keep debtors in debt, wanted to keep interest rates high, wanted to restrict the supply of money. For Bryan and many people who supported him, this was a way of keeping Americans who were poor, keeping Americans who were in debt deeper in debt. It was a way of keeping the British economy, the supreme economy in the world, because the British economy was based on the gold standard. So it sounds like a very technical issue, but really it was an issue of the haves against the have-nots. At least that's the way Bryan saw it. And so to crucify mankind across the gold would be, of course, connected to Pontius Pilate crucifying Christ. In the same way, Bryan and the populists and populist-minded Democrats and populist-minded Republicans, too, thought that the American economy was being run for the interests of those who already had property, or those who already had money, those who already had banks and big industries. And so there was really a kind of class divide in American politics at that time. Now, we have a lot of anger about the economy, but the anger is not focused on money in the same way it was then. Because after all, remember then, every dollar people had in their pockets could be redeemed for $1 in the federal treasury. First with gold, Bryan wanted that to be redeemed in silver as well, which would have meant a lot more dollars could have been minted and coined, because there was more silver in circulation than there was gold. So it was really a call for cheaper money, lower interest rates, and greater economic opportunity for a small business person, for a small farmer, and for a worker who wanted to be a small business person or a farmer.
In your book, you talk about his charisma and
Yes.
what he meant at that time, that he essentially became a celebrity.
Yes.
That he was receiving as many as 2,000 letters a day in the 1896 campaign.
Yes.
You also write about something that he did that was viewed as revolutionary, which is campaigning for the office, as opposed to William McKinley, who had the front porch strategy in Ohio. Can you explain?
McKinley had a lot of money for the campaign. He was able to get checks from John D. Rockefeller, other big industrialists could just write him checks. There were no restrictions whatsoever on campaign donations back in 1896. Bryan, because he was running as a candidate of small farmers and workers, couldn't get that kind of money. So he had to go out and campaign for himself. He wasn't going to be able to depend on a large machine to do that for him. He was a wonderful speaker. He loved to speak, as I said before. So for him, this was a positive thing. So he made a necessity into a virtue, if you will. He traveled at least 18,000 miles on passenger trains, didn't have his own jet, the way candidates do now, didn't have his own railroad car for much of the campaign either. And he spoke to, as many as 6,000 times in that one campaign, many times a day, for example. So for him, this was an opportunity, as Will said, to become known. And also, it was the only chance he had, he thought, to really reach Americans directly.
He's also the first campaigner to use the railroad in this way and to really campaign across the country. Stephen Douglas had done something similar in 1860 in the crisis of the nation, trying to take a campaign swing through the South and through parts of the North and revitalize the Democratic Party. But for the most part, after 1860, American presidential candidates sat on their front porch and other people campaigned for them. And Bryan went out there and campaigned at every whistle-stop town in Illinois and Ohio and Virginia and Pennsylvania, New York, and traveled all over America, bringing his campaign to the people.
As always, we want to hear from you here on C-SPAN. 202 is the area code, 737-0001 if you live in the Eastern or Central time zones, and 202-737-0002 for the Mountain and Pacific time zones. We are in Lincoln, Nebraska, the home referred to as Fairview. William Jennings Bryan and his wife moved here in 1902. Will Thomas, let's take a step back. He ran for the House of Representatives, served 2 terms, and yet he was born in Salem, Illinois. Walk us through the early years of William Jennings Bryan and how did he end up here in Nebraska?
Well, he was born in 1860 into a world that was being transformed. Obviously, the railroad growth, the Civil War that followed, 1860 to 1865. He was too young to serve in the Civil War, and that's something that actually he came back to again and again in his public life. He had not served in the military, and so many men in politics in his period of political activity had served in the military. So he did not have that opportunity as a young man. Instead, he read for the bar, went into practice as a lawyer in Lincoln, Nebraska in the 1880s. He started his own law firm, a partnership with Dolph Talbot, and he practiced basic law in an growing urban environment in the prairie, and that's when he became active in politics.
If I could just add, at the time, and in many ways still, to go to law school was always a good training to go into politics, and he always wanted to go into politics. His father was a judge in Illinois, a very close associate of Stephen Douglas's in the 1850s, and his father helped write the Illinois State Constitution in the late 1850s. So really politics was in his blood, I think, and he never thought of doing anything else but politics in a serious way. He became a lawyer because he wanted to get involved in politics. He moved to Nebraska partly because he knew the Democratic Party was very weak here, and he thought there'd be an opportunity for a young man to rise quickly within the Democratic Party of the state.
Let me go back to the way he was able to capture the imagination of the country. 3 times getting the Democratic nomination. Has that ever happened where you've received the nomination and yet lost all 3 times? Well, the person you profiled the first time, Henry Clay, received the, before there was a Whig Party nomination, and then twice for the Whig Party. But of course, a little bit different in 100 years ago. This was a lot more voters, a lot more media, more money involved. This was really, unlike Clay, who had a fairly small country in terms of population. America was an industrial country by the early 20th century. And so this was a modern campaign, all 3 of them, in a sense that Clay's campaigns were not. And yet, as you write out in your book, Mr. Kazin, that 14 million Americans voted in that election in 1896, and about 75 to 80% of eligible voters, men at the time,
almost 80%.
Cast their ballots.
Some women, too, actually. Women had to vote in Colorado, and they voted in Colorado. A couple other western states, which he won, actually. But yes, 80%, and that was actually, that's the highest percentage of eligible voters in any election, from then to the present. We've never had that high percentage of voters again since then.
And if you could touch briefly on his Senate bid in 1894.
Sure. Well, he started out campaigning to get both the populist and the Democratic nomination. The populists were, of course, an insurgent movement in American politics, rapidly rising. They had secured the House in Nebraska. And the irony of his 1894 Senate campaign is that the Republicans win the legislature, and the Democratic candidate actually wins the governorship. And this reverses what had been the case before. So Bryan campaigns largely, it's interesting, there were two debates, one in Lincoln and one in Omaha. 7,000 people turned out for the debate in Lincoln in October of 1894, and 15,000 people turned out for the debate in Omaha. And so this was a great event to come to this political campaign and be part of it for the public. Bryan started out talking largely in the campaign about the income tax. This was an important issue. The Democrats had passed the first income tax since the Civil War in 1894, and Bryan had been part of that. It was a 2% flat tax on everyone making more than $4,000 a year, so on the rich. And he started his debate with John Thurston on that issue. And then he went to the Union Pacific Railroad and its monopoly power. And the silver issue was down on the list in 1894. It was not as significant as it would become in 1896.
Can I make one point about the income tax real quickly?
Yes.
1895, the Supreme Court rules that income tax unconstitutional, which was, as you can imagine, it's pretty radical thing to do for the highest court in the land to say Congress passed the law, President signs that law, and it's not constitutional. So that helped to inflame things on Bryan's side in the 1896 campaign.
And if you could fast forward, the irony that in 1913, the signing of the 17th Amendment, which stated what?
Yeah, the direct election of senators. Bryan is, of course, expecting to get elected and hoping to get elected. The Republican majority elects John Thurston to be the senator from Nebraska. And another irony out of that campaign is that Thurston becomes the Republican National Committee chair in 1896. So Bryan runs for president and gets the nomination, and the man he ran against in Nebraska in 1894 is the Republican committee chair for McKinley.
Michael Casey, you've spent some time in his home. We're going to go downstairs and look at his study in just a moment, but does this home reflect William Jennings Bryan?
Many ways. I mean, it's a great home, it was at the time. It was considered a mansion, and as you'll see, it's well furnished. He made a lot of money speaking, so in that sense it was a prize. It was a prize for his career. But he worked here. He worked here with his wife, Mary, very closely. In fact, you'll see a double desk they worked on together. So that's an important thing, too, I think, to mention about him, is that he and his wife were partners in his career, as is often true of political wives now. But we don't think that much in the late 19th century of that being true, but it certainly was for the two of them.
Bob Puschendorf is joining us. He is with the Nebraska State Historical Society, and he is in the study of William Jennings Bryan and his wife. Thanks very much for sharing your time and insight with us here on C-SPAN's The Contender series.
Thank you for having me.
So how did he use this home, and how often was he in that study writing?
Well, he would have used the study probably daily when he was in Lincoln. The study was the heart of the home, as he said.
I'm going to have you walk in, if you would, and show us what the desk looked like, and also some of the artifacts that are on top of the desk.
Well, this is the partner's desk that he and his wife shared. They would exchange conversation, compose writings and letters, and help formulate some of the positions that he may have wanted to take for the day.
On the top of the desk, a copy of The Commoner. What was that? Why was that significant in his life? And I know that he has signed the copy that's directly in front of you.
Well, I think it could best be stated right in a quote from the first edition of The Commoner, which I have right here. It says, "The Commoner will be to satisfy if by identity to the common people it proves to its right to be the name which it has been chosen."
You've studied the man, you've studied this home, you've studied his life. What do you find especially interesting about William Jennings Bryan and how it's reflected in his home here that he moved in back in 1902?
Well, the home can really tell us a lot about the lifestyles of Mr. and Mrs. Bryan and their family. I think one of the most important stories that came out of the restoration of this house was the role of his wife and the interpretation of her life, which is best represented here in this office.
And the two sat directly across each other and worked on everything, basically, correct?
They certainly did. Bryan had said that his wife was a beloved wife and helpmate.
How much of the material there is original?
Very few of the pieces of original Bryan furnishings survive. These furnishings in this office have been collected to represent what was originally in the room based on some very fine 1908 photographs of these spaces.
But if he was seated in that chair adjacent to you, would he feel comfortable? Would it feel like his study at the turn of the century?
It would be very much like his study at the turn of the century, even the cluttered desk and the open Bible.
Bob Puschendorf, who is with the Nebraska State Historical Society. We're going to check in with you throughout the program. Thanks very much for opening up this home to C-SPAN cameras. James is joining us from St. Albans, West Virginia, as we welcome your calls and participation in this, the third of our series, looking at the life and political career of William Jennings Bryan. Go ahead, James.
I'd like for you to talk a minute about Thomas Nast.
Thomas Nast.
Thomas Nast was a great cartoonist, responsible for, among other things, the most popular image we have of Santa Claus in this country. He was a German immigrant. Very popular images of the, he created the image of the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant. But by the time that Bryan ran in 1896, I don't remember if Nast was still alive or not, but politically, besides those images, Nast is best known for these really vitriolic and very effective images of Boss Tweed, this corrupt boss of Tammany Hall in New York City in the late 1860s and early 1870s. And his images of Boss Tweed looking like a seedy devil, you might say, really helped to bring Tweed down. And actually, he was a Democratic candidate at the time, an important prosecutor in New York City, Samuel Tilden, later on Democratic candidate for president in 1876, who really prosecuted Tweed and was able to bring down the Tweed ring, as it was known.
And of course, we know about the Hayes-Tilden dispute. We'll go to Rob next from Sacramento, California. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. My question originates from the American President series. During the Grover Cleveland episode, the historian was asked about what Grover Cleveland thought of William Jennings Bryan, and he said that Grover Cleveland hated William Jennings Bryan, and then he was cut off and he wasn't able to finish. So I was kind of curious, what did he hate him for, and if in fact is that true? Thank you.
You want to take it?
Well, I'll start, Michael, and you can follow up. He didn't like, Grover Cleveland was a hard money Democratic president. He didn't like Bryan's position on the silver issue. He particularly didn't like the income tax that Bryan had championed in the House and had helped pass. But it was the silver issue and breaking with the Cleveland administration's repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act that most got the ire of Grover Cleveland.
Yeah, Cleveland was representative of the old Democratic Party, a Democratic Party of commercial interests from the East, especially New York, where Cleveland was from himself. He was from Buffalo. People who believed, like Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, that the government should not really do very much in the economy. In fact, during the Depression of the 1890s, Grover Cleveland said that the people should support the government, but the government should not support the people. And this is very different from what Bryan believed. Bryan was, in our parlance today, was a liberal. He was a democratic liberal. He believed the government should be strong enough to help people who could not help themselves, and he wanted to redress the balance between corporate power and the power of workers and small farmers. And so And also Cleveland had broken this railroad strike that Will talked about, the Pullman strike, with federal troops. And the Attorney General at the time, Cleveland's Attorney General, was actually a railroad attorney at the same time as he was breaking the strike by railroad workers. So for Bryan, Cleveland was, in the 1890s at least, representative of all he didn't like about his party and all he didn't like about American politics.
Well, Thomas, in order to get a better sense of the man, I want to use Michael Kazan's words from his book and get your reaction. Because he said that we lack politicians today filled with the convictions and blessed with charisma who are willing to lead a charge against secular forces whose power is both mightier and more subtly deployed than a century ago.
Bryan was a champion of those who needed help. He was a man of great conviction, and one of the things that he was trying to do that was most difficult was to take on the economic powerful class that had emerged in American politics and American economy in a way that didn't look like class warfare. That was what was so hard for Bryan to be able to do, to not appear to be a demagogue, to do it sincerely, to speak to the people without tearing down, but instead attempting to build up. And that was a very hard case to make. And he did it beautifully, but it was a very difficult attempt to try and reveal the inadequacies of American society at the time without looking like someone who's just tearing down the American ideals.
So those are your words. Are there parallels to somebody today in American politics that would resemble a William Jennings Bryan?
I'm not sure. There are people who will want to be William Jennings Bryans. Sarah Palin, in some ways, tried to be in 1896. That is, there are angry populists. There are people who believe that a small, greedy elite is after the majority of Americans. But you know, Bryan was a representative of a movement, I think, an anti-monopoly movement, a movement of people who believed that corporate America was taking the country in a revolutionary direction. And we have, for better or worse, I think, come to grips with or made our peace with big business. And we can't imagine a society in which big business is not there, whereas that was not true for Bryan.
Yeah, I think just where we are here in Fairview, Bryan's home, we just looked at the desk that he worked with Mary Bryan side by side. Most businesses were like that in America in the 1870s and 1860s and 1850s. They were partnerships. They were small partnerships, small firms. And that period before 1896 was a period of enormous industrial growth. Colossal corporations emerging in American society. The Pennsylvania Railroad employed more people than the United States Post Office. You know, so these were corporations with enormous resources, enormous wealth, and enormous power. And most people had experienced a very different America, one of small partnerships, and that change was arresting. And Bryan was really speaking to that massive transition in American society, American life.
We've been talking about money and politics since the very early campaigning in this country, but I want to let you listen in on our audience to the 1900 campaign in which William Jennings Bryan talked about the issue of transparency, knowing who is contributing to whom. Here are the words of William Jennings Bryan from his second of 3 campaigns for the White House.
An election is a public affair. It is held for the benefit of the public and is the means through which the people select their officials and give directions as to the policies to be adopted. There is no sound reason for secrecy in regard to campaign methods, and publicity will in itself prove a purifying influence in politics. The necessity for publicity has increased with the growth of favor-seeking corporations, for the people ought to know what influences are at work in the campaign, that they may better decide whether either party has so obligated itself to the great corporation as to make it impossible for it to protect the rights of the people.
From the 1908 campaign with William Howard Taft, has anything changed a century later?
It does sound like debates about Citizens United, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, obviously, people with a lot of money want the government to do things they want the government to do. People with little money do too, but there's a lot of influence that you have if you have a lot of money, obviously. Bryan actually was in favor of public financing of elections. He didn't want private individuals to be able to give any money to elections. But he realized that wasn't going to fly at the time. So his idea at the time was at least publicize the donations that people give. Let's make sure that everyone knows it's above board. For example, in 1996, John D. Rockefeller just wrote a check on Standard Oil check for $250,000, and he gave it to Mark Hanna. And that was not known until after the election was over. So Bryan wanted that at least to be known if that happened. 1907, the first serious campaign finance law had been passed, which banned corporations from giving money directly to campaigns. But individuals could still give as much money as they wanted to. So the connection between influence and money is still something we argue about all the time and fight about all the time, and the court has ruled on it. But it's an issue which has certainly not died.
William is joining us from Detroit. Good evening. Please go ahead.
Good evening, gentlemen. How are you guys today?
Just fine, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I had a question I wanted to ask because I just caught the program and I wanted to understand. William Jennings Bryan, was he a supporter of the gold and silver standard in currency in America?
He wanted the money supply based on both gold and silver, which at the time would have meant that more dollars would have been put in circulation. There would be more money out there. Prices would have gone up, but that meant also that people who produce crops would have seen their prices that they were able to get for their crops go up, and it meant interest rates would have gone down because more money would have been in circulation. So it sounds arcane, it sounds exotic to us today, but the best way to think about it, I think, is that Bryan wanted cheaper money, more money in people's pockets, and interest rates to go down so people could borrow more easily.
He gets the nomination in 1896. He is renominated in 1900. What happened in 1904?
1904, the Democrats decided to go with a less exciting candidate, a more conservative candidate who they thought could appeal to a more traditional electorate. They nominated a guy who'd never run for office before. Well, I'm sorry, he'd run for judge before. Alton Parker, his name was, from New York. A very gray candidate, I think it's fair to say. A man who did not go around the country giving speeches, but who was more like Grover Cleveland in many ways. Though not, he had some of Bryan's politics, but none of Bryan's charisma, none of Bryan's appeal to ordinary Americans. And he got killed in a landslide by Theodore Roosevelt.
And then the party comes back to William Jennings Bryan in 1908. Why?
Well, Michael, the party is in great need of a leader, and it's a party that's divided by region. It's had a great deal of difficulty uniting around a candidate and making its voice heard in the national election. And Bryan is that voice. He's a tremendous charismatic figure.
And yet you had three Republicans, William McKinley, he then is assassinated, Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, and then William Howard Taft elected in 1908. So let's go back to something else that was, I guess, rather revolutionary, set up the debate that took place and how that occurred, technically speaking, in 1908.
Well, there wasn't actually a debate the way we have debates now, but 1908 was the first time in which both candidates recorded speeches on wax cylinders, these things which are, you can still hear very scratchy renditions of them. Perhaps you'll play one that the Library of Congress owns some of these copies. But this was the original short-playing record. They didn't last very long, 2-3 minutes, and but they went into studios and they recorded them. So, and this was Bryan actually sold these too to campaign supporters. So it was a way you could hear Bryan, you could hear Taft without them having to go out and speak you directly. Of course, we take that for granted now, but this was a very new idea at the time.
In one of the campaign buttons of William Jennings Bryan in 1908, we're going to begin with the words of William Howard Taft, followed by William Jennings Bryan.
I have known a good many people who were opposed to foreign missions. I have known a good many regular attendants at church, consistent members, that religiously, if you choose to use that term, refuse to contribute to foreign missions. I did not realize the immense importance of foreign missions.
The truth is, we've got to wake up in this country. We are not all there is in the world. There are lots besides us, and there are lots of people besides us that are entitled to our effort and our money and our sacrifice to help them on in the world.
Imperialism is the policy of an empire, and an empire is a nation composed of different races living under varying forms of government. A republic cannot be an empire, for a republic rests upon the theory that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and colonialism violates this theory. Our experiment in colonialism has been unfortunate. Instead of profit, it has brought loss. Instead of strength, it has brought weakness. Instead of glory, it has brought humiliation.
The words of William McKinley and William Howard Taft. Of course, Taft goes on to win the election in 1908. But did William Jennings Bryan change as a candidate from his first race in 1896 to his third bid in 1908? And what issues dominated the 1908
Well, there was a key
campaign?
issue in each of those campaigns. The key issue in 1896 was the gold and silver issue and the issue of the Depression and sort of class divisions in that sense, and regional divisions. The big issue in 1900 was imperialism. The U.S. was fighting in the Philippines to try to stop the Philippine independence movement from winning a war or insurrection against U.S. occupation of those islands, and that was a big issue in that campaign. 1908, there were several issues. Bryan tried to make the power of the trust, the power of big corporations, the issue. His slogan was, "Shall the people rule?" But Taft was perceived as progressive at the time. He had been the Secretary of War under Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is a progressive president. So in many ways, similar to, if some of your listeners remember, some of your viewers remember, George H.W. Bush in 1988 running as sort of the hand-picked successor to Ronald Reagan. George H.W. Bush was not a tremendously charismatic figure, certainly, but if people like Reagan, they thought, well, if you like Reagan, I guess I can vote for Bush. Similarly, people like Roosevelt tend to think, well, we'll be safe with Taft, and that's why he won. So Bryan tried to use a lot of the same rhetorical techniques. He went out to talk to hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in that campaign, as he'd done before. But it wasn't very successful. The country was prosperous again after a sharp recession in 1907. So times are fairly good. Taft was popular because he was the hand-picked successor to a very popular president, Theodore Roosevelt. So Bryan couldn't get very much traction that year.
In fact, his closest race was 1896.
Yes.
As we look at the election results from 1900 and 1908, we're joined by Marie, who's joining us from Connecticut. Welcome to the conversation. Go ahead, Marie.
Thank you very much. I'd like to know, how did William Jennings Bryan come to live in Miami, Florida?
In fact, Boca Raton, Florida, or Coral Gables,
yeah.
Florida.
His wife, Mary, contracted very bad, really crippling arthritis when she lived in this house, actually. And she didn't want to, really couldn't live in the winter climate of Nebraska any longer. Miami was beginning to be a place for older people to go if they could afford to. And also, he had been in the South before. He had a lot of very strong supporters in the South, did Bryan. And so they'd go into Miami. They'd stayed at friends' houses in Miami before, and they decided to move there. And it was a very good move for Mary, certainly.
And you tell a story in the book about how he was also used to try to help bring other people to
yes.
Coral Gables, including the Venetian pool that's still there today.
Yeah, he became a promoter. In the 1920s, after he'd given up all hope of becoming president, he began to make some money giving speeches for land promoters. This was not one of his, more sort of honorable adventures, perhaps. But after all, he needed to make money, and he did.
And again, just to understand this period, then we move into 1912, and a Democrat finally wins the White House, but it's not William Jennings Bryan.
Right. It's Woodrow Wilson. And, the Democrats had struggled for some time, and Bryan had led much of this struggle against the Republican Party, and really for the votes of working people, I think, and the broad middle class. The Republicans were able over that period to co-opt many of the issues that the populists and the Democrats had brought forward. And develop their agenda as a progressive party. Theodore Roosevelt was the master of this. And Bryan and the Democrats had a very difficult time reaching that broad middle class and convincing voters that they could bring progressive change, not radical change, but progressive change. And Wilson was able to do that. He was a professor at Princeton. He'd been governor of New Jersey. He was a very moderate reformer, but a progressive reformer. And he was able to succeed where Bryan was not.
You want to follow up?
Well, I should emphasize the only reason Wilson won was because the Republican Party split in 1912. And Taft proved not to be a real progressive successor to Theodore Roosevelt. At least Roosevelt didn't think so. And Roosevelt tries to wrest the nomination away from Taft in 1912, fails to, then goes out and becomes the nominee of this new progressive party. So if the Republicans had stayed united, we'll never know what would have happened, but it's quite possible that Wilson would not have been elected.
Michael Kazin, who teaches politics and history at Georgetown University, the author of A Godly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan. And Will Thomas is the chair of the history department here in Lincoln, Nebraska at the University of Nebraska. And Josh is joining us from Phoenix. Good evening. Welcome to the program.
Yes, hi. Good evening. Great show. Thank you for your show. I wanted to ask something a little different. I wanted to see if the gentleman could speak to Mr. Bryan's foreign policy attitudes and what he thought about, say, the Spanish-American War or European colonialism, and if he ever went abroad, and what would the gentleman think that how he would handle, for example, now Afghanistan and Iraq and the invasion. I mean, what was his mindset back then in terms of, how the major colonial powers around the world were going into other countries and, controlling them and such? And what was his theory about that, about all of that, and how did he feel, in general, his foreign policy? Thank you very much.
Josh, thanks for the call. He served as our 41st Secretary of State, so maybe that best reflects his views on foreign policy, Michael Kazin.
Well, in some ways, really, before that, it does. I mean, after all, he served in the Spanish-American War, but once the war ended, he opposed as I said before, the occupation of the Philippines, and he was an anti-imperialist at a time when there was a very large anti-imperialist constituency in the United States, and he did travel around the world for a whole year with his family from 1905 to 1906, being financed by William Randolph Hearst, who he wrote articles for. And as he went around the world, he went to Indonesia, which was then controlled by the Dutch. He went to India, then controlled by the British. And at each stop, he denounced the European powers who controlled those countries. So in principle, he was opposed to rich countries dominating and owning poor countries. That doesn't mean that he was opposed to all wars. He was opposed to what he thought of as unjust wars. And when he was Secretary of State, he resigned as Secretary of State in 1915 because he thought the United States was about to enter World War I after the Lusitania, this very large passenger ship, a British passenger ship, had been torpedoed by a German U-boat. The U.S. did not get into the war at that time, but he resigned as Secretary of State because he was so opposed to World War I. He thought World War I was an insane war the United States should not be part of.
Well, take it one step further. What was his relationship like with Woodrow Wilson, both during the campaign in 1912 and then his tenure as Secretary of State?
Well, in 1912, he does come around to supporting Wilson in the convention in Baltimore in 1912. In fact, when he supports Wilson in that convention, it helps to put Wilson over the top. At a time when you needed 2/3 of delegate votes to win. It was a very old-style convention, 46 ballots. But he and Wilson never really were close. Wilson had not supported Bryan, 1896. Wilson had been a more conservative Democrat up until 1908, 1909, and so the two didn't really trust each other. Wilson came to this house at one point, came to Fairview, and was not impressed by it. He was an intellectual, and Bryan was not intellectual, and he was sort of disparaging of Bryan's intelligence and Bryan's interest in the world. So the two were not close. Bryan became Secretary of State in large part because it was a political appointment. At that time, it was not unusual for the leading figure in the party, who was not the nominee, to be nominated Secretary of State by an incoming president. In many ways, Wilson expected to be his own Secretary of State. And one of the reasons Bryan was unhappy as Secretary of State was that he didn't get the kind of responsibility he would have wanted. But one thing he did do, which shows something about his views about war and peace, he convinced various foreign powers to sign peace treaties with one another, saying they would not go to war with one another. These are pretty much symbolic, but he gave each of them a little bronze plowshare with the line from Isaiah about beating your swords into plowshares as a symbol of these treaties. In the end, of course, the treaties didn't stop World War I. But for Bryan, as a good Christian, showing a humanitarian face to the world was one way of actually acting in more humanitarian ways.
Larry is joining us from Delaware. Welcome to the program. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you for listening to me. I do have a religious question about Bryan's religion. But first, let me say that I applaud his efforts to level the playing field for the common man against big business. Free enterprise defeated communism. It's about to defeat democracy. What impact does your panel think Bryan's fundamental Christian religious beliefs had an impact on his election results?
Thanks for the call. We should point out, too, the Bible is open to the book of Ezekiel in his desk, which is directly below where we're at. We are in the parlor at his home in Fairview. But what about the role of religion in his life and his wife's life?
Well, it's a big question. I mean, one of the things about Bryan is very important, that he never really separated religion and politics. We think of that now as something that some people, more conservative people, think that you should have a Christian government, America's a Christian nation. But for Bryan, his Christianity was what he called applied Christianity. It was really the social gospel. That is, he believed that if you're a good Christian, you want to go out and save the world. You want to go out and help the poor. You want to go out and help workers. You want to level the playing field, as the caller mentioned. So for him, his religion and his politics were not separate. But in some ways, this, I think, hurt him among some people who were not evangelical Protestants, which most Americans were at the time, by the way. But Catholics, Jews were somewhat less enthusiastic about him because he was such a crusader. And also, he supported Prohibition beginning in 1910 and was a very big supporter of what became the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. And this was a very, divisive issue in American life. He came to Prohibition because he wanted to purify the American body politic. And for him, this was a Christian issue. And that meant that a lot of people from 1910 on didn't trust him, even people who had voted for him before, because he was a prohibitionist.
And one side note, he did not drink, but he did enjoy eating.
Oh, yeah. Sometimes when he was on the campaign trail, giving all these speeches a day, sometimes he ate as many as 6 meals a day. And he was known he could devour 3 chickens at one sitting.
If you're just tuning in, this is C-SPAN's The Contender series. We are looking at 14 candidates for the presidency. All 14 lost, but in their own way, they shaped American politics and in many cases resonate today with the issues that they put forth. We are coming to you from his home in Lincoln, Nebraska, referred to as Fairview. It's now part of the medical center here in the state capitol, and our phone lines are open 202-737-0001 for viewers in the Eastern and Central time zones, and 202-737-0002 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. This is an exterior view of what the home looks like, and you can see the Bryan LGH Medical Center directly adjacent. This home is open to the public. It does offer tours for those of you who travel through Lincoln, Nebraska. Nadine is joining us from Palm Springs, California. Go ahead, please.
Hello, this is Nadine Hill from Desert Hot Springs near Palm Springs in California. And I have like a Kodak picture in my files. He has a relationship with my family. And my hobby is genealogy. I'm not a Mormon, my hobby, and I research my family. I have 6,200 names in it. And I would like to know about buying the book or speeches or what you have and how much it is and where I send the money.
Well, before you get an answer to that question, we want to ask you who's in the photograph and what is your connection with William Jennings Bryan, at least through your own family research?
As far as I know, he's in a car in this picture. It's like a Kodak picture. And he's in the car looks like a single-seater with a top down. And I always thought that the other man was the one whose name I can't remember, who didn't believe in religion.
Clarence Darrow.
And I'm 94 years old and almost 95, so I can't remember his name now. But I have this, and he is in my family. I have 6,200 names I've researched, and on my computer. And I don't say, oh, I'd like to have that one. I research them and be sure they're my relative.
Well, Nadine, I'm going to ask you to stay on the line, and we're going to try to get your phone number if there's a way we can get you connected with Mr. Kazin directly, and his book is called A Godly Hero. But stay on the line. We'll get your phone number, and she brings up another part of his life. Dayton, Tennessee, the Monkey Scopes trial, and Clarence Darrow.
Well, I was just going to tell Nadine that we have put all of William Jennings Bryan's speeches from 1896 online on our digital project. And so if she'd like to use her computer to look at those speeches, there are hundreds of them. Every speech he gave in the 1896 presidential campaign is online on the Railroads in the Making of Modern America website that we started here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
And all the material from this series is available online. 14 weeks looking at presidential contenders. Thecontenders.cspan.org is our website. Michael Kazin, the Scopes trial.
Yeah, well, in many ways, William Jennings Bryan is known, if he's known at all, for a lot of Americans because he was one of the prosecutors in this trial in Tennessee in July 1925, which was prosecuting a teacher named John Scopes, who was teaching the theory of evolution in high school in Dayton, Tennessee. And what's interesting about this is that this issue is still very much alive with us. Of course, large number of Americans believe that the Bible, the Book of Genesis is the truth, is how the earth was formed, and Bryan believed that too. But it's important to remember also that for Bryan, one of the things he disliked about the theory of evolution was he thought it was not just Darwinism, but social Darwinism. That is, he believed it taught the survival of the fittest, it taught that might makes right. He put out a series of lectures about evolution before the Scopes trial, which was entitled Brother versus Brute. So for him, to be a good Christian meant that you were against the theory, the social theory of evolution. He didn't really understand the science very well, but he believed, rightly or wrongly, that the way the science was being applied by some people who were done very well in American society, by some people in the military, was that those who were doing well in society were those who should do well, who were biologically inclined to come out on top. And this is one of the things he disliked about the theory. But again, he was a fundamentalist, and he believed what the Bible said was true, and so he thought school children should not be learning something which would counteract that.
There is an iconic photograph of Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan in 1925 in Tennessee. How did the two come together for this historic moment in American history?
Well, Bryan was asked by the prosecution to help in the trial. This was the state law that had just been passed that year in Tennessee, and they knew that if Bryan helped them, this would draw a lot of attention to the case. Similarly, once Clarence Darrow, this great defense lawyer for labor candidates, labor figures like Eugene Debs and many others, when he heard Bryan, a former friend, by the way, was going to work for the prosecution, Darrow said he had to be on the other side. The ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, which had just begun several years before, financed the defense of Scopes. One thing that people should know about this, people might have seen Inherit the Wind, that famous movie starring Spencer Tracy and has the Darrow character and Frederick March as the Bryan character. In fact, unlike what the movie shows you, Scopes never went to jail. Scopes was basically he agreed to be a defendant because he knew a trial was going to take place somewhere in Tennessee, and his town of Dayton, Tennessee, where he taught high school, was hurting economically, and so he wanted to help bring some business to Dayton, Tennessee. That's why the trial took place there, because Scopes agreed to be a defendant.
And technology was a factor in this trial. Cameras were allowed inside the courtroom, and it was broadcast nationwide on radio.
Right, and one of the things that is so remarkable about this trial is not only that it was broadcast on the radio and tens of thousands of Americans listened to it, but it also it was a courtroom, and for Bryan to try to defend his Christianity and creationism in the courtroom, it was the context of the courtroom and cross-examination that made it so difficult for Bryan to say what he really meant and what he was trying to convey about the importance of creation in his thinking, and about the social Darwinist logic that, as he saw it, was infecting American society, as Michael pointed out. And so it was a very difficult context in which to make that argument. And so Bryan ends his life, really, in a sort of a man out of context, making an argument in a place where, unlike 1896, where the context was perfect for Bryan to make the Cross of Gold speech, the context of the courtroom in Dayton, Tennessee proved very challenging for Bryan.
Peter is on the phone, joining us from New Jersey. Good evening. Welcome.
Hey, how are you doing?
Great.
Hello?
Go ahead with your question. Yes, you're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to make 1 point, and then I'll get off. You're a douchebag.
Okay, we'll go to Mark next. We apologize for that phone call. We'll go to Mark in Arlington, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm calling because I've noticed that the gold standard debate appears to have made a comeback recently, with networks like CNBC having debates about whether the gold standard should be brought back, and then people will come out on the other side of the issue arguing against the gold standard, against the Federal Reserve, and for the government's ability to print its own currency. And those people in particular almost always seem to quote William Jennings Bryan to support their argument. So he seems to be making a comeback, at least in that regard. And my question for the panel then was if they themselves see any ways in which his Cross of Gold speech in 1896 is relevant to the America we live in today.
And let's bring it to the 2012 campaign, because Ron Paul has talked about the Federal Reserve, and even Governor Perry has been critical of Ben Bernanke, making some pretty sharp comments about him. So to the caller's point, and to what William Jennings Bryan was talking about a century ago.
Well, the gold and silver standard, the legacy of that debate, I think, was, among other things, the Federal Reserve System. It was also getting off the gold standard eventually in the early 1930s. But, you know, what Bryan really wanted, and those who were on his side in this debate wanted, was a more flexible money supply. They wanted, you know, in hard times, interest rates to be able to go down, and more money in circulation. In prosperous times, they were happy to have them go up. You know, it's the kind of thing the Fed does today, actually. And this was seen at the time by a lot of Americans as a great reform. Now, of course, when we get in economic trouble like we are now, people look for, you might say, panaceas, you know, going back to the gold standard, for example. But I think, you know, as a historian, I think that many ways, one of the reasons we've been able to avoid serious economic downturns between the Great Depression and now is because we have had a flexible money supply, and the Fed has been able to take charge when necessary. I don't know, Will might have a different point of view.
Well, I think that one of the big issues that Bryan was trying to confront with the silver issue and the gold standard was the great contraction of the American economy. And we've lived through a similar contraction in the American economy recently. And so I think it's not surprising that some of these issues are coming forward when they are right now. I think the difference is, of course, that Bryan's efforts to broaden the money supply were mainly aimed at trying to rescue a class of Americans who were struggling deeply with their financial well-being in their situation. And so I don't see that quite playing out today in the same way when the gold standard is being brought up.
Our two history professors representing Georgetown University and the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Michael Kazin is also the author of A Godly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan. And Will Thomas teaches history here. He's also the author of The Iron Way, Railroads, the Civil War, and the Making of Modern America. Harold is joining us, Youngstown, Ohio. Good evening.
Good evening. It seems rather ironic that many of the parallels from William Jennings Bryan's day and our day, it's just amazing. Where again, we're arguing, soft money versus hard money, and we see, and we do see class warfare. The class warfare argument. Except this time, the argument's coming from the rich against the poor, as opposed to the poor against the rich. And I could say the irony is just, in my mind, just amazing.
Who'd like to take that point?
Well, I think it is interesting to look back at that time because for Bryan, making the argument not only about the money supply and the silver issue, but also about the income tax and about the monopoly power that he saw all around and the corruption in politics and the trusts, all of those things together, he was accused by the Republicans of practicing a form of demagoguery or of class warfare, of opening the door to class warfare by even mentioning these things and bringing them up. And so Bryan was trying to lead, or from what he saw, he was trying to lead Americans to see that the class in power was not necessarily looking out for their own interests. And that was his main argument, but he had to frame it in a way that it didn't become class warfare. Americans didn't want class warfare. They'd seen a series of strikes in the last 20 years that looked an awfully lot like class warfare or something that they feared from Europe, communist organization and conflict. And so that fear of class warfare is very vital to the period of the 1890s when Bryan's campaigning. It turns out that the strike of 1877, for example, with the militia and the federal government bringing out Gatling guns and mowing down American workers who are striking, that didn't sit well with American people. And so Bryan was walking this thin line, trying to raise the issue but not be accused of class warfare.
William Jennings Bryan was born in Salem, Illinois. He moved here to Nebraska as an adult, where he practiced law, ran for Congress, served 2 terms, and became the Democratic presidential nominee in 1896. He moved to this home in 1902 with his wife, Mary, and Bob Puschendorf, who is with the Nebraska Historical Society, is down below. My question is, how did they use the home back in 1902 when they first moved here?
Well, it's an interesting combination of uses. The second floor, right up above where you're sitting, was the family bedrooms and sleeping chambers. The first floor was meant primarily for entertaining. You can see the wide spaces, the open spaces where they would entertain their friends. And the lower level was more of a family area, including the dining room and, of course, the office in which we had seen earlier.
As you researched the uses of this home and the visitors of the home, who would have been here?
Well, there were a number of prominent guests, Woodrow Wilson being one of them, but a number of social acquaintances as well as political figures would have been visitors to the house.
And we talked earlier about the name of the home, Fairview, because it really did give you a sense of the Nebraska landscape. Now, of course, it's the home of the medical center.
That's correct. Bryan said that the house was one of the most beautiful vistas of farm country that he had ever seen. They acquired the land east of Lincoln and chose this site for their new home in 1901.
What is his legacy, Will Thomas, here in Lincoln, Nebraska?
Well, I think he's one of the most famous sons. I think his name is widely recognized by both Nebraskans and nationwide. I think Nebraskans are proud that we have generated people of his stature, even though he did not win the presidency. It was an important aspect in Nebraska's political life to have such a character.
This home, of course, being a historic landmark. His legacy, Will Thomas?
Well, I think he does bring the Democratic Party into Nebraska's history. Of course, there were Democrats here before William Jennings Bryan's campaigns, but he elevates the Democratic Party in its stature in Nebraska. Here, obviously, he's a major figure in Nebraska history, and but the local legacy, of course, is this home and the hospital, which bears his name.
John is joining us from San Francisco as we look at the life and political career of William Jennings Bryan. Go ahead, please.
Bryan publicly defended the Ku Klux Klan in the 1924 Democratic National Convention. Did he also privately embrace the practice of lynching in the South?
He did not defend the Klan in 1924. I'm not defending him retrospectively. The debate in 1924 Democratic Convention in New York City was about whether to denounce the Klan by name or not. He believed that Democrats should win over the Klan rather than denounce them. But, you know, he certainly had supporters who were in the Klan, but it's unfair to say he was a supporter of the Klan. He was not. He was a racist against African Americans. We would consider him that now, but he did not support violence against them. He denounced lynchings. But he was a white supremacist. And, but I just want to clarify, his racial views are not so simple as to say he was a Klansman or he was in favor of lynching people without a trial. He supported the views of most white Southerners and most white Northerners at the time as well, which was that they thought European Americans were superior to other people. And so in that sense, he was certainly not a modern figure.
Yeah, I think he's certainly a Democratic political figure in the sense, from that period, in the sense that he broadly believes in white supremacy, and he's appealing to votes in the Democratic South really on those terms as well.
So what would he think of the Democratic Party today, which counts so much of African Americans as a core constituency for
He would have been
its election?
surprised. Yeah. He would have been surprised. You know, for him, he was a Democrat with a small d as well as a large d, but for him, the majority of people in the country were white, and he was mostly concerned with their welfare, it's fair to say. He didn't know very many black people. Actually, the Nebraska side is interesting. In 1896, there was a group of what were called Silver Republicans, African Americans, in Omaha who did support him in that campaign. And he had African Americans to Fairview at different occasions to visit. But politically, he wanted to stay as far from that issue as he could. In fact, in the 1908 campaign, W.B. Du Bois, the great black intellectual and activist, one of the founders of the NAACP, wanted to support Bryan, and did support Bryan against William Howard Taft, but Bryan would not meet with him, did not want to acknowledge his support because he was afraid he would lose parts of the white South if he did.
Our next caller is from Memphis, Tennessee. Chuck is on the phone. Good evening. Glad to hear from you.
Good evening. This series has been fascinating, and your guests are very interesting. This topic is great. I would be interested. I had heard at one time that that L. Frank Baum's novel, The Wizard of Oz, was an allegorical novel about the election of 1896, where William Jennings Bryan was actually depicted as the Cowardly Lion. I'd be interested in your guests' thoughts on that.
Have either of you heard that?
That's one of the great myths of American history. Unfortunately, I used to give lectures about this. It's a wonderful way to teach students about the election of 1896. Different figures in that in the first Oz book corresponding to figures in that campaign. Unfortunately, if you look into L. Frank Baum's biography, it doesn't bear out. He was a window dresser. That is, he dressed windows in department stores. And for him, the artifice of the design of these department store windows was one way he saw American society developing. And for him, the Wizard of Oz was a figure of sort of commercial artifice in that sense. So really, Baum would have been, I think, surprised by the allegorical meanings that people have found in his first story, even though it's an entertaining way to look at it. Unfortunately, it's probably not true.
Let me put another parallel on the table, because in 1999 we sat down with Karl Rove, in which he talked about the McKinley campaign of 1896 and how he tried to take some of the lessons from that campaign for George W. Bush in 2000. Can you touch on that?
Well, one of the things that the 1896 campaign did was it established the Republican Party in presidential elections, at least, and most congressional elections too, up until the 1930s, as the majority party. There was really no majority party in America in the Gilded Age, that is from 1868, roughly 1872 until 1896. And so what Karl Rove wanted to do was produce a new Republican majority based on what he would have seen as the most forward-looking elements of the business community, and also a pretty heterogeneous group of middle-class American voters. And one of the ways Rove wanted to do that was by including Hispanic voters, a very large group in the population and growing. Similarly, McKinley tried to appeal to European immigrants at the time, which was a very large, expanding group in the population. And he was able to, in 1896 and 1900, to win over German voters, for example, German-American voters, who had, for the most part, been Democrats before, but most of them became Republicans for various reasons. And so Rove saw not just McKinley, but Mark Hanna, the impresario of McKinley's career and his presidential campaigns, producing this new Republican majority. It didn't happen, and George W. Bush was not as successful a president as William McKinley.
We are coming to you from Lincoln, Nebraska, where William Jennings Bryan served 2 terms in the House of Representatives, went on to run for the presidency on 3 separate occasions, beginning in 1896. At the age of 36, Frank is joining us. Salem, Illinois.
Oh.
Go ahead, please. The hometown, the birthplace of William Jennings Bryan.
Yes, we have his birthplace is open to the public on if you call in advance. My question is, how much influence did WJ have in getting his brother nominated in 1924 to be the vice presidential candidate?
Yes, that's a sidelight people don't really know about. In 1924, then governor of Nebraska, what's his first name again? It's terrible, I'm forgetting his first name. Charles Bryan, younger brother of William Jennings Bryan, was the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, coming out of that tumultuous convention in 1924. It was more because of his name than because William Jennings Bryan, his older brother, pushed him. At that time, William Jennings Bryan was a very divisive figure in the party, partly because of the Klan debate, partly for other reasons. But the Bryan name was still sort of, the Democrats hoped, would enable them to win a lot of rural votes, especially in the Midwest, which they're afraid, progressive rural votes, they're afraid we're going to go to Robert La Follette, who was running an independent campaign for president in 1924. So Charles Bryan in 1924 was, his nomination as vice president by the Democrats was an attempt by the Democrats to keep some of the progressive farm vote on their side. And for the most part, it did not succeed.
Terry is joining us from Easton, Pennsylvania, as we look more from the study of William Jennings Bryan. Go ahead, Terry.
Gentlemen, very interesting talk. You stated that William Jennings Bryan was a fundamentalist and progressive. And I believe states like Kansas and Nebraska, which had large fundamentalist populations, were also, during his day, very progressive. Today, they are extremely conservative. What happened to cause this change?
No, you go ahead.
Will Thomas, what did happen?
Well, that's a great question. I think the progressivism that Bryan espoused had a great deal to do with the economic conditions of his day, and the prosperity that came forward in American life changed that in the 20th century in ways that Bryan couldn't have predicted. In terms of today's conservatism, Bryan also foreshadows some of that in his commitment to faith in public life. But his faith, as Michael's already pointed out, was based around a social gospel movement, an applied Christianity, helping those in the cities, helping those in need, and that branch of Christian thought and experience did not grow in the same way as the fundamentalist movement.
Chris is joining us. Austin, oh, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, just one quick question before I go to Austin. What Will said is quite right. And another thing to think about there, too, is both liberalism and conservatism changed their views and their postures towards very active Christianity in public life. Liberals generally, especially white liberals, got sort of soured on public religiosity and became more identified with big cities, more identified with a more pluralistic, more secular kind of religious landscape. Whereas conservatives who were not particularly evangelical, actually the late 19th, early 20th centuries, became much more identified with the Christian right in the 1970s and going after it. And the issues were different too. I mean, abortion and gay marriage were not issues for Bryan.
A Godly Hero, the life of William Jennings Bryan, the work of Michael Kazin, and The Iron Way, Railroads, the Civil War, and the Making of Modern America, the work of Will Thomas from University of Nebraska here at Lincoln. Chris, you've been patient. Thanks so much for waiting. From Austin, Texas, go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call. Bryan was populist in both ways, in economics and social issues. On economics, that meant progressivism. Social issues, that meant conservatism. And there was a similar movement in Europe, the advent of Christian democracy going on as well. It seems there's no really outlet for that a position like that within today's two major parties. But I was wondering, I think that there's actually a big constituency for that if there was an outlet for it. I was wondering, get your take on what you think the possibilities of a Bryan-type position would have today in American politics.
Thanks for the call and the question.
Well, every politician today, whatever their ideological position, in a sense, has to be, at least has to appear to be a religious person, whether they go to church or not. So in that sense, everybody who has a chance to become president is a religious person, and so far, at least, a Christian. But I think, though, that it's most people on the liberal side of politics mistrust people who talk too much about their religion in politics, and most people on the conservative side want that religious talk to be focused primarily, I think, on issues of the body, you might say, issues of personal piety, of personal responsibility, of abortion, of same-sex marriage, of this kind of thing, stem cells and so forth. So the kind of social Christianity that, as you say, many Christian Democrats in Europe stood for, and certainly Bryan stood for, I don't see that really as a real possibility, at least in the near future. One actually figure who is important to realize is we have a national holiday named after him, who's Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was very left-wing in economics, but obviously he was an evangelical minister at the same time. So, we, in some ways, there's a lot of differences between Bryan and King, their race among others, but it's interesting we have a national holiday named after somebody who did try to put together what you might call a kind of conservative, not quite fundamentalist, but very conservative sense of biblical truth, and also a very left-wing belief about economic issues.
And on a separate note, the connection between William Jennings Bryan and Arbor Day, what is it?
Well, this goes to Nebraska again. His mentor in Democratic politics in Nebraska was a man who was a leading figure, was never elected in his own right, but became the father of Arbor Day. It was a way to bring, getting Sterling Morton, as a way to bring more business, really, to this part of the plains.
Larry is joining us. Everett, Washington, good evening.
Yeah. My question was about the Australian ballot, or the secret ballot, or the lack of one, 1896, 1900, 1908. Did Bryan ever talk about the need for a secret ballot, or would it, if they had one in that time, would it affect the outcome? I've read anecdotally where there have been a lot of episodes where employers made sure that employees put in the right ballot for McKinley and things like that. Is that true, and did Bryan ever talk about it?
Thanks for the call. Who'd like to take that?
I'll take it. Bryan did talk about the secret ballot. It was a subject of some discussion in 1894 and 1896. It wasn't a major issue, but it came up in contexts like the potential corruption of companies that would bring in voters to vote for elections or require voters to vote in a certain way, that is, their employees. These accusations were made especially in Nebraska with regard to the Burlington Railroad, that it had in fact released all of its men from its western job sites and brought them into Omaha or Lincoln and told them which way to vote. And so, so that kind of activity led politicians like Bryan and others to object and to call for the kind of secret ballot that would allow individuals to vote for who they wanted without the pressure of corporate interests in the election.
Our next caller comes to us from Reno, Nevada. Go ahead, please. Rand, you're on the air.
Silver State.
Wonderful. We'll go to Nancy. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Our next caller comes to us from Reno, Nevada. Go ahead, please. Rand, you're on the air.
Okay, caller, you with us? We'll try one more time for Rand. We're getting some feedback. So let's go to Nancy next, joining us from another town important to William Jennings Bryan, Dayton, Tennessee. Go ahead, Nancy.
I am Nancy Sawyers, and I'm from Dayton, Tennessee, home of the Scopes trial. I have, I'm not old enough to remember it. I'm just 70-something. But I know several people that were there, and it was a carnival-like, and the drugstore was there for many years, and the table where it all started, and as I understand, it just started as, let's do something exciting or unusual. Let's do this, and so that's how it got started, as these older people have told me. And Dayton has grown into a booming little town, and it has a play on the anniversary depicting the trial, and it is a very interesting play for people to come from all over the United States to see. And I just wanted to say that we were kind of dubbed as the monkey town for a long time, but now we're known as home of the Scopes trial. I did not know William Jennings Bryan, but I did meet Clarence Dale at a tea held for him in by the women of Dayton, and we're glad that it happened there. And as I was told, it was kind of started for Chattanooga, and Chattanooga really didn't want it, so they decided to bring it to Dayton, and it has brought much economy to the city of Dayton. So,
well, Nancy, thank you for calling, and thank you for sharing your firsthand account to that famous trial. Thoughts from either of you?
Yeah, well, you know, it's actually, talk about tourism. There's a very good museum in the basement of the courthouse in Dayton, Tennessee, about the trial and about the reception of it around the world. And you can also visit the courtroom itself, and I've sat in the judge's chair. But the famous cross-examination, Darrow cross-examining Bryan, was actually not held in the courtroom itself. It was held on a lawn outside. And And if you think about it, as many as 3,000 people were probably in attendance listening to and watching this cross-examination. This is a kind of trial, we don't have that kind of trial today, but it was, as she said, a carnival, and it did help the economy of Dayton a good deal, and it was an economy which needed help at the time.
Let's talk about the legacy of William Jennings Bryan, especially when it came to women's rights and prohibition and the federal income tax and the popular election of U.S. senators. Will Thomas.
Well, I think Bryan's legacy, and Michael Kazin beautifully handles this in his book, the legacy itself is damaged by the end of the Scopes trial, and in particular H.L. Mencken's obituary of Bryan, which depicts Bryan as just a bumbling, backcountry, kind of misguided figure in 1924, 1925, in that period. And so his legacy is tarnished, really, at the end of his career by this. And Michael's book, I think, recovers Bryan's legacy beautifully. All of the reforms that he championed, women's rights in particular, the right to vote, the suffrage, which was an active issue in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and Bryan was at the forefront of it. And other issues as well that you just mentioned were ones that he was deeply involved in from the beginning.
I think, I emphasize this in the book, I think one of the legacies of Bryan, which is important, is in many ways, without Bryan, you don't get Wilson, and you don't get Franklin Roosevelt. I think he really was the major figure in remaking the Democratic Party into a party we think of today as, for those who don't like it, the big government party. For those who do like it, more economically liberal party. He does in 1908 forge for the first time a very strong relationship between organized labor, then the American Federation of Labor, and the Democratic Party, a relationship that for the most part has remained for the last century between those, that movement and that party. So, he wasn't obviously the only figure who did this, but I think he was the key figure in the Depression of the 1890s in helping to make the Democratic Party into the kind of party we think of it as today, that is, wanting the government to be stronger to serve the interests of working people, of people who were down on their luck. So in some ways, that is a very important legacy, which he doesn't often get credit for.
This is a what-if question, very briefly. Had he been elected president, what kind of a president would he have been?
I don't think a very good one, actually. I think his skill was as an orator, his skill was as an agitator, his skill was as someone who could put forth ideas, rally people to support those ideas, but he probably would not have been a very good administrator. He wasn't a very good administrator as Secretary of State, and as president, he would have been a very divisive figure, and it would have been very difficult for him to, I think, work directly with the opposition party in Congress.
We have time for one more call. Mark is joining us. Dallas, go ahead, please.
Yes. In 1900, did a Senator Joseph Blackburn run against William Jennings Bryan for the nomination, and did he tie with him? Can you tell me about that?
Blackburn got a few votes, but 1900, most Democrats rallied around Bryan. It was not really a close contest. It was pretty much decided by the time they got to the convention, which was unusual at that time, because usually conventions back in that day were pretty tempestuous affairs. They really were, the nomination really was decided at the convention, but that was not true in 1900. 1900, by the time they got to Kansas City, where the convention was held, it was pretty clear that the nomination would go to Bryan again.
Two other famous speeches at Democratic conventions. In 1984, Mario Cuomo delivers a keynote that propels him to the national stage. And in 2004, State Senator Barack Obama delivers the keynote address, and many say that propelled him to the presidency. Are there parallels to William Jennings Bryan?
Well, Obama in that sense is a parallel, certainly. Though, as Will said, he was better known in 1896 than I think to Americans than Obama was in 2004, which might seem surprising because of all the media we have. But Bryan was giving speeches all around the country before 1896 to pro-silver crowds. There have been other great convention speeches. Hubert Humphrey gave a famous speech for civil rights in the 1948 Democratic Convention, which sort of put the put the Democratic Party on record as being for civil rights, which had never been before. But we have no other parallel in American political history where someone gives a great speech and then at the same convention gets the nomination.
What about today? Are there parallels to other modern politicians?
Well, I think Obama's speech in that way is similar. It vaults him to national prominence. Michael's right. Bryan had already achieved much of that, but the sense of party unity that both of them brought and to those speeches, and the kind of sincerity and speaking across a broad range of the public, and really speaking outside of their party as well. Both of them are able to do that in those settings. They're different in other ways, but there is a similarity.
William Thomas is the chair of the history department here at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and Michael Kazin, who teaches history at Georgetown University. You put the book A Godly Hero together when?
I started doing research on it around 1996, about 100 years after, and it was published in 2006.
We thank you for your perspective on the life and career of William Jennings Bryan. Our thanks to the staff here at the William Jennings Bryan home who've opened their doors to the C-SPAN cameras, and to the staff and administration at the Bryan LGH Medical Center, which makes up the campus that we are at, part of the Bryan home, often called at Fairview. We want to leave you with more of the words of William Jennings Bryan as we continue our look at his life and career, and you can check it out online on cspan.org, the Contender series. But in the words of William Jennings Bryan, what made an ideal republic? Here's what he had to say.
Hold a republic, resting securely upon the foundation stone, quarried by revolutionary patriots from the mountain of eternal truth. A republic applying in practice and proclaiming to the world the self-evident propositions that all men are created equal, that they're endowed with inalienable rights, that governments are instituted among men to secure these rights, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Behold a republic in which civil and religious liberty stimulate all to earnest endeavor, and in which the law restrains every hand uplifted for a neighbor's injury. A republic in which every citizen is a sovereign, but in which no one cares to wear a crown.
The Contenders features profiles of key figures who've run for president and lost, but